Welcome to Truth Watchers. I am Heath Henning. Today we are going to follow up on some recent news about Michael Heiser. To me, this is exciting news because Dr. Thomas Howe has recently published 2 books exposing Heiser's false doctrines. His first book, published in November 2024, is titled The Unseemly Realm. This book right here. The Unseemly Realm, a critical analysis of the writings of Michael Heiser. This book I highly recommend because it's dealing with Michael Heiser's theological system and writing more broadly. Howe's second book is a title called Reversing Heiser, right here. A critical analysis of Michael S. Heiser's Reversing Herman. As the subtitle suggests, this book is focused specifically on Heiser's book, Reversing Herman. Personally, I thought Reversing Herman was one of the worst books Heiser wrote. I remember reading it at work while I was on break and hoping nobody would ask me what I was reading because it was embarrassing. The theological views, the arguments, the sources he used to present his views in Reversing Herman were just horrible. I'm surprised that book ever made it into print. For the next 2 weeks, I will briefly interact with each of Howe's books individually. For those who have read my book, The Unbiblical Realm, you may remember on page 32, I quoted Howe's article, The Unseen Assumption, which was posted in August 6th, 2019. The conclusion of that article is what I quoted in my book, where he stated, quote, Heiser has a bad hermeneutical method because he has a bad hermeneutic philosophy. This bad philosophy has led him to bad conclusions. There have always been Christians who have tried to come up with some unique and revolutionary interpretation. Heiser is not the first to come up with this notion of a council of gods. You can see this in Gnosticism, in Marcionism, and in other adaptations of basic Christian doctrines. I'm sure he won't be the last, unquote. This comment is expressed as a review on Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, and Howe includes the same comment, only slightly different, in the conclusion of his book, The Unseemly Realm, page 290 through 291. This tells us that Howe, in reading more thoroughly the works of Heiser, had only solidified the original impression that Howe made after reading The Unseen Realm. In my book, page 32, I also quoted from Heiser's response to Howe's article. I quoted Heiser's comment stating, quote, I assume that the scripture writers were communicating to people intentionally, people that lived in their day and who shared their same worldview. This assumption is in place because I'm sensitive to imposing a foreign worldview on the writers, unquote. This is exactly why I refer to Heiser as a Gnostic, as I have repeatedly explained that the early church fathers defined Gnosticism as those who were synchronizing paganism with Christian or biblical terminology or allegorizing scriptures to fit their pagan mythologies. The Bible emphatically expressed the need to be separate and separated from the pagan culture and their surrounding pagan neighbors of Israel, not to adopt their religions and practices or even to inquire into theological views. Heiser admittedly synchronizes, or as he put it, imposed the foreign worldview on the Bible and theology. However, what I want to address today is more of an introduction to Howe's expanded work in his 2 new books. Actually, I don't know if Howe intended to place such an emphasis on what I found very interesting, but his remarks on this issue abound. The issue that I am referring to is what I have been saying for years now. That is, Dr. Michael Heiser was a liar. I have said that very bluntly, and I know it offends many people who follow his teachings. I made the comment bluntly many times in my book because I showed how he alters quotations on many occasions and misrepresents the ancient texts he refers to. And now I will show Dr. Howe has made similar comments from his research, though Dr. Howe is less abrasive in the way he says it. First, I want to mention something else the Heiserites get upset with me for saying. That is the fact that Heiser was a liberal. His education was in secular institutions, and all the books he references were liberals. If you look at his bibliography that has over 2,000 titles, it is all liberals. The only conservative author I ever saw Heiser reference was John Walton, and I personally wouldn't classify Walton as a conservative. I would consider Walton to be more like F.F. Bruce, who considered himself a liberal evangelical. Now, Heiser's mentor for his doctoral dissertation was Michael V. Fox. Professor Fox literally taught that somebody who believed the Bible was incapable of accurately interpreting the Bible because they were biased by their belief. Of course, the Bible teaches the exact opposite, that unbelievers can't discern the things of the Spirit. Fox's faulty logic is implied and can be read all through Heiser's work. Why did he only quote liberal scholars? Why did he accept the liberal views from non-believers? Why did he refuse to listen to all the conservative scholars that exposed his bad theology? But again, this comes down to his education in secular universities. He claimed to have walked away unscathed from the atmosphere of such an education, but at the same time, it was at Madison University, which he acknowledged to be the most liberal university, when that's where he accepted his theological views of the divine plurality. And I should add, from liberal or secular scholarship, he learned to lie about and misrepresent his sources to propagate his false theology. I want to share a quote from the late Bill Cooper, who frequently exposed how liberals lied to cover up facts that provided evidence for the Bible. After going through ancient texts and archaeology that confirmed the existence of the kings mentioned in Genesis 14, Cooper writes, quote, "Their very existence goes unmentioned, and a deliberate and calculated lie is inserted in their place, the lie that the names of these kings are unknown to us from the historical record, and that the writer of the book of Genesis either errs in his ignorance or blatantly deceives those who read him. The information that we have been considering is not just withheld from the public, of course, it is also withheld from all those students who are busy pursuing their degree in modernist colleges and universities, entirely unaware of the fact that they are learning and then propagating a lie. They go on to teach their own students and to write in their own publications the lie that they in turn have been taught. The education system of the Western world are geared to suppress independent thought, and open inquiry is discouraged at all levels. Let a student's dissertation once range beyond the lecture notes that he has been fed, and let his conclusions raise but the smallest question marks over what he has been taught, and he will be severely marked down for it, even failed altogether, if the question mark is big enough to embarrass his tutor. The much vaunted scientific method in all this is a sham." Unquote. So for the Heiser fans to think that Heiser was not the slightest bit impacted by his education is insanity. Why would someone choose to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get indoctrinated by people who hate the Bible and spend their life teaching students to reject it? The fact that Heiser refers to the consensus view being the Israelite religion evolved out of polytheism during the Babylonian captivity shows the obvious liberal influence. No conservative scholar teaches that, so surely Heiser did not read any conservative scholarship. Now, let's get to what I want to point out from Dr. Howe in his book, The Unseemly Realm, page 29. Howe writes, quote, "For Heiser to present his translation as if it is straightforward is frankly not honest," unquote. The end of the sentence, that phrase, "is frankly not honest," becomes a mantra repeated over and over throughout the book. In fact, I counted 22 times where Howe calls Heiser not honest in the unseemly realm. You can see, as I have posted up on that page, the multitude of page numbers. And in reversing Heiser, another 2 times he calls him not honest. And you could see that as well. Nevertheless, Howe uses many other expressions to identify that Heiser was lying about his research, if we can appropriately call it research. Howe accuses Heiser of misrepresenting material in the unseemly realm 13 times, and you can see all the page numbers up there. And in reversing Heiser, this becomes the favorite expression, appearing 16 times. Still, there is many other expressions Howe used to identify Heiser's lies. Howe called him deceitful once in each of these books. He used the term disingenuous, which is defined as, quote, of a person or their behavior slightly dishonest or not speaking the complete truth, unquote, in an online Cambridge dictionary. The charge of disingenuous appears once in the unseemly realm and once in reversing Heiser. Reversing Heiser uses more creative ways of saying the same thing. Howe quotes Heiser on 3 occasions and calls his statements misleading or simply false. Also, the phrase commonly used to express the same idea is accusing Heiser of selective reporting. This charge appears 6 times with the specific phrase, while the same charge is made without using the specific phrase an additional 4 times. These additional comments are interesting to look at. They are as follows, and this is from Reversing Heiser, page 203, quote, as is his practice, Heiser does not give all the information, but only the portion that seems to support his position, unquote. From Reversing Heiser, page 204, quote, Heiser seems not to be beyond taking out of context any quote that he thinks supports his view and applying it to a topic to which the quote has no relation, unquote. From page 207, quote, as is his practice, Heiser conveniently leaves out the part that goes against his view. Heiser omits the portion that reads a second visitation because he cannot make it fit his interpretation, unquote. And on page 217 through 218, he writes, quote, Heiser is simply wrong in each of his observations. Unfortunately, Heiser goes from wrong observations to absurd speculations in an attempt to support his view. It seems that Heiser does research only far enough to refer to what seems to support his view, but then misrepresents what he discovers, unquote. There are a number of other examples of Howe using other terms or expressions that identify Heiser as a liar. I'll share a couple here. On page 137 of Reversing Heiser, Howe writes, quote, the problem with Heiser's argument is that they are ultimately speculation, guesswork, and wishful thinking combined with poor scholarship and mishandling and misrepresentation of the evidence, unquote. Another example is from page 168, quote, Heiser fails to provide his readers with the complete picture. This is yet another instance of selective reporting. There are other passages in this chapter, he's referring to chapter 6 of Reversing Herman, that Heiser mutilates, such as his misunderstanding and mishandling of Psalm 68 and Paul's use of it in Ephesians 4:8. Heiser simply ignores scholars when they don't agree with his view, and he presents his interpretation as if they are the only reasonable ones, unquote. I know I'm just quoting Howe's comments and not explaining the context and the thorough research he has behind the conclusions he makes, but he obviously sees the same thing I saw when I read Heiser's work. The problem is most people reading Heiser are not familiar with the sources Heiser is referencing. For me, it was obvious that he twisted the Second Temple Jewish literature. His claims that this body of literature proves his view are simply false. Hence, a number of times in my book, I showed Heiser altering quotes, and I'm planning to expand my book with a second edition to add more examples of this in an appendix. Howe also notes a number of times he found Heiser altering quotes. On page 106 through 107, Howe refers to Heiser's article, Monotheism, Polytheism, Monolatry, or Henotheism, wherein Heiser attributes a definition of the word henotheism to Max Mueller based on Michiko Yusa's comment. However, Howe noticed, quote, "The problem is Mueller never makes such a statement in the entire book. Heiser, who refers to himself as a biblical scholar, simply did not do his homework," unquote. So what we see here is that Heiser lifts quotes from secondary sources without checking them. I had this suspicion of Heiser ever since I first started reading his work. This is why I have called him a liar and stated that he either is lying about having read the primary sources or he is lying about what they say. Of course, my research is in the ancient literature, and I saw him misquoting these texts. So I assumed he might be taking quotes from secondary sources and not checking them for accuracy from the primary sources. But Heiser's footnotes the primary sources as if he has read the ancient texts he is misquoting. I believe he didn't actually read the ancient texts he cites in his books, but lifted the quotes from secondary sources written by the liberal authors he reads. The liberals lie, alter quotes, and force their misconstructed interpretations on these sources, and Heiser has swallowed their lies and propagated their lies to gullible evangelicals who don't bother checking his sources and think he was some profound scholar. Another interesting misquote Howe notes is on page 112 in the unseemly realm. In footnote 2, Howe wrote, quote, "Interestingly, the quote Heiser says is in the introduction to I Dare You Not to Bore Me with the Bible actually does not appear in that book, at least not in the version that is available in Logos," unquote. So how is identifying Heiser actually misquotes himself? There are two things I want to note about this factor. One is the abundance of Heiser referring to his own works in his books. I noticed this when I was researching Heiser, and when I read his book Demons, I counted no less than 93 footnotes referencing his own work, and sometimes single footnotes could have multiple references to his works. But you can't even count on him to accurately reference his own material. Secondly, as I exposed in my second article and in my book, The Unbiblical Realm, pages 60 through 61, when Heiser responded to my first article on his blog, he quoted himself, but misrepresented his own quotations of himself. He attempted to make his quote sound as if he rejected polytheism, when in fact the context of his own quote was he rejected the idea that ancient Israel evolved out of polytheism during the Babylonian captivity. Heiser taught Israel remained polytheistic until the rabbinic period. So you can't even depend on Heiser to accurately reference his own material. All his footnotes and sources need to be double checked to determine whether he has accurately represented the authors he cites. Heiser simply cannot be trusted, and this is not scholarship. If Heiser actually read the ancient literature he quotes, then he lied and misrepresented it himself. I give him the benefit of the doubt and assume he ignorantly trusted liberal authors and lifted their inaccurate quotations from their books without checking. But evidence also provides reasons to believe the reverse option. That is, that Heiser actually did lie and alter the quotes himself. If he is willing to misrepresent his own writings, why wouldn't he lie about other authors too? Howe's second book, Reversing Heiser, again, documents a number of times when Heiser alters or misrepresents quotes. I counted 5 times in reversing Heiser, which Howe noted his deceptive methods of handling quotations. And this needs to be remembered that Howe is only interacting with Heiser's reversing Herman in that book. On page 119, Howe writes, quote, as is his tactic, Heiser conveniently omits those portions that are contrary to what he wants the quote to say, unquote. Again, on page 131, Howe writes, quote, this is another tactic of Heiser. He subtly changes the text to fit his interpretation. Heiser changes the text in order to make the text conform to his claim that the woman is in the constellation, unquote. Again, on page 229, Howe writes, quote, Heiser references the dictionary of deities and demons in the Bible, yet this reference work never actually uses or refers to the word Bethan. In fact, in the section of the dictionary in Heiser's endnote, pages 161 through 163, the author do not even use the word serpent. It seems that Heiser created his own pitfalls and errors, unquote. On page 237, Howe writes, quote, Heiser attributes the translation to Nickelsburg, but this is not how Nickelsburg translates the verse, unquote. Again, on page 243, Howe notes, quote, Heiser is notorious for omitting important portions when he quotes, unquote. And on page 244, Howe writes, quote, Heiser gives a lengthy quote from a translation of Tertullian's text, and then Howe shows how Heiser quoted Tertullian and follows that comment, the quotation with the comment, the problem with this is that is not what Tertullian wrote, unquote. And then he shows the actual quote of Tertullian and how Heiser alters a quotation from Tertullian. So to conclude with today, I'm not interacting with Howe's main arguments, but wanted to simply show that Howe, whether he intended it or not, exposed exactly what I've been saying for years, and that is that Heiser is a liar. He cannot be trusted. Anything he wrote or said or taught, even quotations he provided to show his research, even when he quoted himself, all of it needs to be double checked because Heiser was a liar. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning in to Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.